got out of college, I assume you started to work at a company. Did you also like work with all these software projects as part of your work, or is it more like coming out of college, a personal interest?
I definitely didn't go to a company. The running joke was that that HP and nearby Corvallis, be it making printers or otherwise, hired the entire previous class, but then we Generation Xers were left without those same opportunities. So we had to fend for ourselves. And I I naturally, like that generation, saw the potential of the web and thought, okay, I want to develop, not necessarily as much visually, but I want to host things myself. And I became an independent, hoster, self-hosted indie hoster, as they call them, back in '98, and I haven't stopped. I, from all the privacy reasons, all the you name it reasons, that is like a human right, and it needs to be easy, and that's still a challenge, no question at all. And especially hosting mail, etc. We all did it back in the day, and it was hard. And so I did have a local practice doing that type of design and hosting and print material to go with it. I do quite a few visual materials to this day. Um, I did work briefly for Mandrake Soft SA, the French company making Mandrake Linux, Linux Mandrake. They went through their budget and cut the US team, so that didn't last super long, but it was just a great sort of pinnacle of having a Linux job. Um, so I did my kind of reinvention in Latvia and almost took a break from such technologies for a while. But when I left Latvia, things like OpenZFS were coming online, back then purely ZFS coming out of Sun. And soon after that, things like the 1 terabyte hard drive, because storage was pretty painful until the arrival of that. So that reminded me that, wow, there are countless opportunities. And I suppose one super defining point was that in the '90s, I looked at the Microsoft Windows NT stack for 3,000. You get an OS, you get a web server, and like a mail server or something, and it all worked great on paper. In practice, your hands are absolutely tied. It's unreliable. It's a bunch of things. It is what it is. Everyone has their own opinion, but it became very, very clear that if it's not open as a provider, your hands are tied. And not everyone wants to discuss anything related to the kernel. They don't. I get that. But you do have to dig down in the stack and just learn to report issues, even if you have no clue what might cause it or what the solution is, but just identifying, be it a, a trace back or something, it is useful for all involved to just have some basic skills in that to hand it over to those who know, because those who know are often amazing people working in free and open source projects. So uh, just that defining moment of knowing my hands were tied with those proprietary solutions. I don't see how one can run a business of any kind, of any sort, without some exit to true support in the entire stack, regardless of the involvement needed to engage in that, if that makes sense. Going from there, FreeNAS, TrueNAS support has been keeping me busy since, and I'm now ready for my next sort of change in direction. It'll undoubtedly use the same underlying technologies without question, because the technologies are getting really, really good.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that? What technologies in particular?
That trifecta I mentioned, the OpenZFS file system, I don't know to what degree you're familiar with it, but back 2005-ish, Sun decided we now have the hardware resources to do things we could never do back when Dr. McCusick designed the modern fast file system that everybody has copied. I can't emphasize that enough. You either live in the '90s or you live in the future. And so with the blessing of modern hardware, you can do things like continuous checksumming, because your CPU is a lot faster than your disks. So you can have data integrity guarantees that were not possible. Even if you were checksumming everything on the same file system, you still have the risk of those checksums disappearing in the process, or to a second file system, which would be completely impractical and expensive back in the day. So ZFS then and now is a stunningly capable rethink of everything prior to it, and built with a budget. It's not a volunteer project, though it was opened by Sun, which is wonderful. And when Oracle acquired Sun, the Open ZFS project sprouted from there, and it's very alive and very well. And people may not know that it's on, for example, Windows and Macintosh and NetBSD and FreeBSD and others. I've used it on Mac since Xevo was a proprietary implementation about 12 years ago, and it's treated me very well. So everyone needs to save data, and it needs to be safe. And there are the challenges relating to other operating systems and licensing. There are the efforts to provide some of its features elsewhere. Apple's gone down that road. The Linux folks in various ways have gone down that road. But it's good to be a decade or so ahead, because in file systems, as they say, you get one chance with people's data. It's obviously had its hiccups now and then, like any piece of software, but users are often the challenge in there. And that's where all of these things need to be user-friendly in some way. Containers are obviously huge. FreeBSD pioneered that with jails back in 2000. And through simply their quiet nature or something, they're not leading the market, despite it being a very proven in-kernel technology. And on top of that, hypervisors came along, and NetBSD Zen was one of the very first Zen platforms. But for the same reasons, they're not the go-to platform among the three of us. But I used their Zen implementation back in like 2005. It treated me well, but it was limited in scope with a limited development team. But what it did extremely well. So that all changed when, in FreeBSD circles, will change for me, when a large storage vendor produced a hypervisor for FreeBSD. And I thought, that is cool. And I approached the developers, and it turns out I was the first developer outside that vendor, our first user outside that vendor. And I've been talking about it at conferences since, 2010-ish, 12-ish, and host a call every Thursday regarding it. And I think between the solid foundation of a forward-looking file system and volume manager, ZFS, OpenZFS, and a security mechanism like the jail container, and a hypervisor, which I run with Windows Server guests in production not far from here, those are everything I was hoping for. And one of the things I like to say at a conference is, down in the basement, I still have my Computer Shoppers, this giant magazine. Phil, you may remember,
remember
that.
them.
It was
Oh,
like
yeah.
this
Oh, yeah.
thick and large format, and I wanted to try everything in there. They had columns on Amiga. They had columns on Next. They had columns on all these fascinating OSs, OS2, on and on and on. But with hardware being so relatively expensive back then in the 90s, 2000s, you couldn't have 8 computers to try 8 OSs on. It was just absolutely unfeasible for an individual or a student or otherwise. So once hypervisors came along and allowed one to experiment with something they were curious about, Alpine Linux, a small little scrappy Linux that really quick. It can be a few minute process instead of a purchasing decision.